In the peaceful stretches of space, where stars glittered like tiny diamonds against the vast black canvas, the galaxy was at ease. The empires that ruled the countless worlds were stable, planets were flourishing, trade routes busy, and the wars that had once threatened to tear everything apart seemed like distant memories. The galaxy had found a sense of peace, but peace, as they say, is often the calm before the storm. One fateful day, a strange signal reached the Galactic Council, the highest authority in the galaxy. The signal was faint at first, like a whisper in the void of space. It barely registered on the scanners. But something about it was different. The Council's technicians, used to picking up everything from distress calls to casual communication, felt a shiver down their spines as they analyzed it. The signal wasn't like anything they had ever encountered. The source of the signal was located on the edge of known space, beyond the territories of the powerful galactic empires. It came from a remote system, one that was barely charted, and it was encoded in a manner no one in the Council had seen before. The encryption was old, ancient even, like a long-forgotten language that only a few remembered. But that wasn't what worried them the most. It wasn't just the encryption or the strange pattern of the signal, it was the message. The signal repeated the same distress call over and over. "We are in danger. Please help us. Send help. Earth, the Deathworlders, must return." The words hit like a thunderclap in a quiet room. Earth, the word echoed through the Council chambers. The name of a long-lost world that had been wiped from galactic memory centuries ago. The human race, or so the legend said, had vanished without a trace. Their death worlds, known for their ferocity and savage survival, had been reduced to myth. No one had heard from them in ages, and most assumed they had died out. But here it was, an SOS from the very edge of the galaxy, begging for help, and mentioning Earth, the lost home of the legendary Deathworlders. The Council's leaders were silent, staring at the holographic readout of the signal. This was no ordinary distress call. The urgency in the message, the cryptic mention of Deathworlders, humanity's most feared legacy, sent a chill down their spines. These were people who were once capable of conquering entire star systems, of standing toe-to-toe with the fiercest empires. Yet in this call, they were begging for help. The room was thick with tension as the Council scrambled to process what they were seeing. Was it possible? Could humanity still be alive somewhere in the galaxy? And if so, why hadn't anyone heard from them in all these centuries? The questions raced through everyone's mind. But no one had answers. Only the eerie signal, still repeating its desperate cry. "We need to investigate," one of the Council members, a senior strategist, finally said, breaking the silence. "If this is true, if the humans have returned, it could change everything." Another Council member, a representative from the Zorith Empire, spoke up, his voice cold and cautious. It could also be a trap. The humans were not the peaceful race everyone remembers. They were warriors, Deathworlders. What if they've returned to claim what they once had? The words hit harder than expected. What if the humans weren't just asking for help? What if they were demanding it? The legends of the Deathworlders, of humanity's brutal ways, flooded the minds of the Council. It was said that the humans were capable of fighting entire fleets with just their sheer will and strength. To think of them as anything less than a threat was dangerous. Despite the fear, there was also curiosity. The Zorith Empire, known for its military might, was one of the first to offer to investigate the signal. The Council debated for hours, sending out drones to the edge of space to locate the origin of the distress call. The journey was long, and the galaxy watched anxiously, waiting for answers. But as the ships traveled deeper into the unknown regions, something else started happening. The signal grew stronger. It wasn't just a faint whisper anymore. It was like a pounding drum, calling louder with each passing hour. Whoever sent the message was desperate, and their need for help was growing. Every passing moment felt like a ticking time bomb. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the signal stopped. The Council's leaders froze in shock. The message that had plagued them for so long was gone, leaving only a void of silence. The question that hung in the air was simple but terrifying. What had happened to the humans? And were they still alive? The last transmission, sent just before the signal stopped, contained one final chilling message. It's too late. They are coming. The Deathworlders are awake. The room fell into complete silence. No one moved. The weight of those words, the fear, the warning, the promise of something much darker, hung over the council like a dark cloud. The galaxy, once a peaceful and stable place, had just been reminded of a terrifying truth. Humanity's Deathworlders were not a myth. They were real, and they were coming. What had seemed like a simple distress call had just turned into a warning, one that the entire galaxy would soon come to fear. The galaxy had always lived in peace, and the Council's overwhelming assumption was that the worst was over. War had been pushed to the fringes of the galaxy, and life was calm. But the sudden disappearance of the distress signal sent shockwaves through the entire galactic network. Everyone, from the highest council members to the smallest trading fleets, knew something had changed. The sudden silence was unnerving. A few systems had been dispatched to investigate the source of the SOS. Some were motivated by the promise of adventure, others by the promise of finding something, or someone, that could tip the scales in their favor. But at the heart of it, there was an underlying fear. No one truly knew who or what was out there. The mention of Deathworlders was enough to make even the strongest leaders feel uneasy. Council ships now buzzed through space with one thing on their mind: answers. As they neared the edge of the galaxy, the pulse of the galaxy's heartbeat grew fainter. The signal had stopped, but there were other signs. The space between the stars seemed thicker. Tension rippled through every ship. Every crew member was on edge. The thought of humanity's Deathworlders had everyone thinking back to the legends. Even though these humans were long gone from galactic view, stories had persisted for centuries. They were said to be survivors, beings forged in fire, who could thrive in the harshest environments. And when provoked, they could bring devastation. Everyone in the council knew one thing for sure: humanity had been more dangerous than anyone could ever imagine. Meanwhile, on the ship tasked with investigating the mysterious signal, the crew felt their unease grow. The captain, a seasoned warrior, stared out into the vast expanse of space, trying to make sense of it all. What are we really looking for? He thought to himself. His comms officer, a sharp-eyed Zoreth, turned to him and whispered, "Captain, it doesn't make sense. There's no sign of the signal source, but something feels off. We're heading into uncharted space. We're practically walking into a void." The captain sighed. He had fought in many wars, encountered countless enemies, but the fear he felt in that moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just the unknown. It was the idea that humanity could be back, that something terrifying could be coming to reclaim what was once theirs. A transmission crackled through the air. The voice on the other end was distorted, but it was clear. It was from the nearest council fleet, now entering the zone where the signal originated. "Captain, we found something." The voice was filled with disbelief. "It's not a ship, not a station. It's a fleet." The transmission cut off abruptly. The captain's heart skipped a beat. A fleet. "Ready the weapons," he ordered. "Prepare for battle." His crew sprang into action. Weapons systems hummed to life, and shields were raised. The atmosphere aboard the ship was tense. No one spoke. Every eye was fixed on the view screens, waiting for something, anything, that could explain what they had just heard. Within moments, the galaxy's peace was shattered. An enormous formation of ships appeared on the horizon of the edge of space. These ships were unlike anything seen before. They were enormous, their silhouettes haunting against the backdrop of the distant stars. Massive, black, and ominously silent, they moved with purpose, their massive engines glowing as they shifted through the darkness. This was no small fleet. This was an armada. "That's impossible," the captain muttered. This isn't just a fleet. It's a whole war machine." The entire galaxy had expected a simple investigation, a mystery with a few answers. But this was something else, something far more dangerous, and it was headed straight for them. Back in the council chambers, panic spread as news of the fleet reached them. Some voices demanded that they prepare for immediate defense, while others hesitated, not wanting to provoke something they didn't understand. The name of Earth echoed in the minds of every council member. What if these were the Deathworlders, humanity's ancient warriors, awakening from their long slumber? What if they had returned to reclaim their place in the galaxy? The council was divided. Some believed that the fleet was a peaceful force, a group simply seeking to reconnect after millennia of silence. Others, however, feared that this was the beginning of something far more catastrophic. What if the fleet was seeking revenge? What if they were angry that their world had been forgotten, their existence erased from the galaxy's memory? On the investigation ship, the crew was on high alert. The captain knew that the next moments would define the galaxy's fate. As the massive fleet drew closer, the air seemed to grow colder. The galaxy's peace was on the brink of collapse. The ships now loomed so close that their sheer size took up entire view screens. And then the silence was broken by a single message that shook every soul aboard the ship. "We have arrived. Prepare yourselves." It was the first real communication the fleet had given. And the galaxy would never be the same again. The Deathworlders had returned, and they weren't asking for peace. As the massive fleet loomed ever closer, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The stars in the distance shone as if indifferent to the chaos unfolding in the vast expanse. However, on every ship, in every council chamber, and within the heart of every galaxy-bound traveler, tension was palpable. Fear had begun to spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The silence was deafening. Every fleet, every ship that had dared approach the advancing Deathworlder armada was now suspended in a strange moment of time. The fleet's intentions were unclear, but there was no mistaking the overwhelming sense of power that radiated from it. This was no random group of wanderers. This was a highly coordinated and dangerous force. The crew aboard the investigation ship felt the weight of the moment. The captain, his hand gripping the arm of his command chair, stared at the approaching fleet with a mix of awe and dread. The comms officer, Zoreth, who had previously warned the captain of the unusual presence, now looked more disturbed than ever. "This isn't just a fleet," Zoreth muttered, eyes glued to the ever-growing mass of ships on the screens. This is a statement, a declaration of something. But what? The captain thought. He had seen many ships, many fleets, but this fleet was different. It wasn't just the scale, it was the design, the lack of any identifying markings. This wasn't just a military force. This was something ancient. Meanwhile, back at the Galactic Council's headquarters, there was no shortage of opinions. Most of the council was paralyzed by fear. Even though they had prepared for the worst, no one had truly believed that something like this could happen. The idea of the Deathworlders, humanity's long-forgotten warriors, seemed like nothing more than a myth. But now, those myths were coming to life. Some council members called for an immediate show of force. They were eager to fight, to stand their ground, despite the overwhelming uncertainty about what they were up against. Others argued for diplomacy, though it was hard to imagine that the Deathworlders had come to talk. "What is it they want?" One of the council members asked aloud, her voice trembling with fear. "Have they come for vengeance? To take back what they lost? What could humanity possibly want from us now?" Others in the chamber shifted nervously, but no one had an answer. Humanity had been silent for centuries. It was a distant memory. The galaxy had continued without them, creating peace treaties and alliances that had held for so long. Yet the one thing that had always been left unspoken was the possibility that the Deathworlders could return. Back in the depths of the galaxy, the investigation fleet had grown more nervous as they watched the armada. The closer they got, the clearer the individual ships became. Massive warships, some larger than entire moons, their black hulls gleaming under the distant stars. Every ship exuded power. Every movement felt calculated. The captain swallowed hard, then gritted his teeth. "Prepare to open communications," he ordered, though part of him knew that whatever came through the comm system wouldn't be comforting. He wasn't sure what to expect, but this was the moment they had been preparing for. For a long moment, there was only static on the line. The crew held their breath, eyes fixed on the display. And then, the channel opened. The voice that came through was neither threatening nor welcoming. It was cold, direct, and full of authority. It sent a chill down the spine of every crew member listening. "We have come," the voice said, its tone like ice, "to reclaim what was taken. Your galaxy does not belong to you." The words hung in the air like a hammer poised to strike. The message was clear. This wasn't about communication. This wasn't about diplomacy. This was about power. The captain's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" he demanded, trying to maintain control. For a long moment, there was no answer, only the hum of the ship's systems in the background. And then the voice spoke again, this time with a hint of amusement. "We want nothing but what was ours. Your galaxy will be reshaped, and we will see to it that those who denied us will pay." The line went dead. The crew on the ship stood frozen. The captain's mind raced as he tried to process the enormity of the message. There was no talk of peace, no offers of alliances, only words of vengeance, of reclaiming a lost empire. Humanity wasn't coming for resources. They weren't coming for riches or to broker some sort of political deal. Humanity had returned for something far more dangerous: retribution. The thought sent shockwaves through the ship's command deck. The captain didn't know what to do next. He had no way of knowing if this fleet was only the beginning or if more fleets were on the way. What he did know was this: the peace that had lasted for centuries was now shattered. No matter how much anyone wished to pretend, the galaxy was about to be plunged into a war unlike any it had ever seen. Somewhere deep in the council chambers, the head of the council stood silent, pondering the same thoughts. The question of what to do next was heavy in the air. Should they prepare for war? Or should they try to find another way, another route to salvation? But the reality was clear to everyone now. War was coming, and it would start with the Deathworlders. As the fleets moved closer, the stars seemed to grow dimmer. The once peaceful galaxy was now a ticking time bomb. And soon, the galaxy would be forced to choose sides. The galaxy was on edge, teetering between fear and disbelief. In every corner of the universe, ships readied themselves, and planets braced for the unimaginable. The silence that had fallen after the Deathworlder's chilling transmission had only lasted a short while. It was as if the entire galaxy held its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. The first strike came not from the Deathworlder fleet, but from a smaller, less significant ship, one of the many sent by the Galactic Council to investigate. It was a desperate attempt to show strength, to gather intel, and perhaps even send a message. But the result was swift and brutal. The ship, a mid-sized patrol vessel from a smaller species in the Galactic Council, attempted to intercept the Deathworlders, demanding to know their intentions. What followed was like nothing anyone had expected: a flash of light, an explosion, and the patrol ship was gone. In an instant, the Deathworlder fleet had displayed just how powerful it truly was. Back on the Council world, leaders scrambled to respond. Communication channels buzzed with frantic messages as fleet commanders tried to make sense of the situation. The Council had sent the patrol ship, but it was clear that this had been a colossal miscalculation. The Deathworlders weren't interested in talks, diplomacy, or even threats. They had arrived with a single purpose in mind: to reclaim what they had lost. The council chambers were a scene of panic. Members argued, shouted, and demanded action. The voices of the military commanders clashed with the voices of those still clinging to hope for a peaceful solution. But no one could ignore the cold truth anymore. The Deathworlders had already shown their hand. "We cannot ignore this," one of the council members said, his voice filled with desperation. They will not stop. The galaxy must prepare. But what can we do? Another council member asked, his face pale. Their fleet is far beyond anything we've seen. Even our strongest ships stand no chance against them. Then we must seek allies, another suggested. There are other forces in the galaxy that might be willing to help us. But the reality of the situation was sinking in fast. No one had prepared for this. The galaxy had grown comfortable in its peace, its alliances, and its technological superiority. But the Deathworlders had shattered all illusions. They were the ghosts of an ancient power, forgotten, but now returning to claim their place. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Deathworlder fleet, the commander stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching as the remnants of the Council's patrol ship drifted into nothingness. The crew on the bridge remained silent, knowing their leader's intentions. The message had been sent. "We have no interest in negotiations," the commander muttered under his breath. "We are not here to talk. We are here to remind them that we are the true rulers of this galaxy." The fleet moved forward, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Each ship was a weapon, each vessel a tool of retribution. The galaxy had forgotten the Deathworlders, and now they would learn the consequences. Back on the outer rim, a small fleet of independent ships had been monitoring the situation. These ships belonged to the war-hardened and mercenary fleets, the ones that had survived the worst the galaxy could throw at them. The moment the Deathworlders had made their presence known, these ships had quietly started preparing for the coming storm. They knew that when the Deathworlders arrived, they would not stop until they had claimed what was theirs. Captain Kale, the leader of the mercenary fleet, stared at the incoming signals from the Galactic Council, reading their panicked reports. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The Deathworlders weren't here to negotiate. They were here for war. And they wouldn't care about who got in their way. "Prepare the fleet," Captain Kale ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We may be mercenaries, but we have our own code. If the Council won't fight, we'll do it for them." Across the galaxy, similar decisions were being made. Ships began to move, forming alliances and gathering strength. The tension was rising, and no one knew how long it would take before the next strike came. One thing was certain. The Deathworlders had made it clear that the galaxy would never be the same again. And so, the countdown to the inevitable battle had begun. The Deathworlders were moving with purpose, their fleets united under one banner. Every ship, every weapon, every mind was focused on the same goal: reclaiming what had once been theirs. In the distance, the Council's greatest fleets were gathering, but their leaders were divided. Some still held on to the hope of negotiating with the Deathworlders, while others realized the true cost of the peace they had taken for granted. They had a choice: to face the Deathworlders head-on, or to prepare for an invasion that could tear the galaxy apart. As the Deathworlder fleet advanced, the first major battle seemed unavoidable. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. The galaxy would be forced to decide whether it could fight back against the force it had long forgotten, or if it would crumble under the weight of its past mistakes. The tension was thick, and soon the entire galaxy would feel the true wrath of humanity's return. Across the galaxy, every faction, every species, and every star system felt the tremor of what was to come. The Deathworlders had shown no mercy with their first strike. The Council had suffered its first blow, and the universe knew that it would not be the last. In the face of such overwhelming power, panic set in among many. But for others, the reality of the situation became clear. The Deathworlders had returned to take what was theirs. In the war rooms of the Galactic Council, the atmosphere was tense. Military commanders, politicians, and even scientists gathered in heated debates. The threat was undeniable. The Deathworlders had been silent for millennia, hidden away in the deep, uncharted corners of space. Now, they were back, and they were taking no prisoners. "I don't care what we've been told about them in the history books. The truth is here in front of us," General Varick said, his voice cold and commanding. "We can't sit here and wait for them to come to us. If we do, we'll be wiped out in days. We must act now." One of the council members spoke up, her voice shaky with fear. "But what can we do? The Deathworlder fleet is far too powerful. Even our most advanced warships were no match for them. We have no choice but to fight." Varric replied, his eyes hardening. "And if we must, we'll find allies. We'll need to make the galaxy stand together, or it will fall apart." On the outer rim of the galaxy, the independent fleets of mercenaries, smugglers, and warlords had already begun to mobilize. Some had already heard the chilling transmission from the Deathworlders, while others were piecing together the aftermath of the patrol ship's destruction. These independent fleets were filled with the most battle-hardened beings in the galaxy. Many had been born into war, and for them, this was just another fight, albeit one that had the potential to change everything. Captain Kale, the leader of a mercenary fleet, stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring out into the cold void of space. His fleet was small compared to the Deathworlder armada, but his crew was skilled, and his fleet had survived wars others had deemed impossible. "We can't wait for the Council to make up its mind," Captain Kale said to his crew, his tone sharp. "The Deathworlders didn't come here to talk. They came for war, and if they want it, they'll have it. We won't wait for permission. We'll fight on our terms." His words echoed through the ship's halls, and the crew stood to attention, ready for the coming battle. Kale had made his decision. Whether or not the Council would back him, he was going to fight. He would not allow his people to fall without a fight. His fleet, though smaller, was not to be underestimated. They had faced down the worst enemies the galaxy had to offer, and now they would face the return of humanity. Across the galaxy, other mercenaries and independent fleets began to follow suit. They knew that this battle could either make or break them. If they stood with the Council, they stood a chance. If they didn't, they would surely fall under the Deathworlder's wrath. As the war began to take shape, an uneasy alliance formed between the galaxy's strongest militaries, independent fleets, and even some former enemies who knew that survival would require unity. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and the Deathworlder's march continued. Meanwhile, on the Council's central world, the debate raged on. While the military leaders prepared for war, political leaders still held out hope for a peaceful resolution. They attempted to send another diplomatic envoy to the Deathworlders, offering them what little they had left to give. But the Deathworlders were not interested in words. They had come to reclaim the galaxy, and they would not be stopped by negotiations. The Deathworlder fleet, still looming in the void, began to move forward. They showed no signs of slowing down. Their numbers were vast, their ships massive, and their technology far beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. They had come with a singular purpose, to remind the galaxy of humanity's power. On the galactic battlefield, the first fleet engagements began. Smaller skirmishes broke out at the edges of known space, but the main event was yet to come. The Deathworlders were methodical. Every move they made was deliberate. Every strike was calculated. They had been waiting for this moment for centuries, and now it was time to claim what was once theirs. At the Council's headquarters, the final decision was made. There would be no more talk, no more peace negotiations. The Deathworlders were coming, and it was time for the galaxy to defend itself, or die trying. "Prepare the fleets," General Varric ordered, standing in the war room with his hands clenched. "The Deathworlders are not here to negotiate. They are here for war." The galaxy had no choice but to respond. It was time to fight back. And so, the greatest battle the galaxy had ever seen was about to begin. The fate of the galaxy, the Deathworlder's return, and the galaxy's fragile peace all hung in the balance. As the fleets gathered, and the first shots were fired, the galaxy knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The day had come. It was no longer just a possibility. It was an inevitable reality. The Deathworlder fleet, an unstoppable force of nature, had arrived in full force, and the galaxy was about to witness the kind of conflict it had not seen in millennia. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as both sides prepared for the clash that would shape the future of the universe. Across countless worlds, the fleets gathered in formation, a sea of ships stretching as far as the eye could see. The alliances forged in the wake of the SOS had already been tested. It wasn't a perfect coalition. Old rivalries still festered beneath the surface. But the fear of the Deathworlder's wrath was enough to unite even the most bitter enemies. Admiral Lyra stood on the bridge of her flagship, staring out into the endless abyss of space. Her hands gripped the edge of the command station as she watched the approaching fleet on the holographic display. The Deathworlder's ships were unlike anything she had ever seen. Enormous, heavily armored, and bristling with weaponry, they'd radiated a chilling aura of power. Their advanced technologies rendered all their enemies' best efforts virtually useless. But Lyra wasn't afraid. She wasn't naive enough to think they would win easily, but she had seen what the Deathworlders were capable of, and she had a plan. The galaxy's only hope was to hit them hard, and hit them fast, before they had a chance to organize their full might. "We've trained for this moment," Lyra said, her voice calm but full of steel. "Remember, they might have numbers, but we have the advantage of surprise. Don't give them a chance to overwhelm us." Her fleet was ready. The preparations had been meticulous. Every ship outfitted with the best weaponry they could manage, every soldier prepared for the fight of their lives. They knew this was a battle for survival. There would be no retreat, no surrender. Either the Deathworlders would fall, or the galaxy would. In the silence of the void, the first shots rang out. The Deathworlders were the first to strike, their massive energy cannons tearing into the outermost ships of the Allied fleet. It was devastating. Entire ships vanished in bursts of flame and debris, their hulls no match for the sheer force of the Deathworlder weaponry. The Allied fleets returned fire, launching waves of missiles and energy blasts toward the incoming enemy ships, but the Deathworlders were prepared. Their shields held strong against the onslaught, and they continued their relentless advance. Admiral Lyra watched, calculating the next move. "Engage the flanks," she ordered. "We need to break their formation. The center is too strong. We have to force them to split." Her ships moved swiftly into position, flanking the advancing Deathworlder fleet. Missiles exploded against the enemy's shields, but they did little more than spark against the impenetrable defenses. However, it was enough to cause a ripple in the enemy formation. Some of the smaller ships began to peel away, giving the Allied fleet the briefest of openings. But then, something unexpected happened. The Deathworlder's fleet commander, a towering figure shrouded in shadow aboard the flagship, had been watching. He knew the Allied fleet would try to flank, and he had anticipated it. Without warning, the Deathworlders released a devastating new weapon, an energy pulse so powerful that it washed over the entire battlefield. The pulse struck the Allied fleet like a hammer, short-circuiting the energy shields and knocking out communications across the fleet. Ships were torn apart in the blink of an eye, as they were defenseless against the onslaught. Panic set in as the fleet scrambled to recover, but the Deathworlders had already begun to press forward, their ships unrelenting. Lyra gritted her teeth. She had expected the Deathworlders to be formidable, but this was something different. This was a weapon that could change everything. "Focus fire on the flagship," she shouted, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "If we can take out their leader, we might have a chance." The Allied fleet, despite the damage, regrouped. They shifted their weapons to target the Deathworlder flagship. A concentrated barrage of firepower surged through space toward the flagship, but the Deathworlders were prepared. Their flagship unleashed a protective barrier that absorbed most of the damage, but it was not enough to stop the entire onslaught. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the battlefield. The flagship's outer defenses were breached, and the shield flickered. The tide was turning, if only for a moment. The Allied fleet pushed forward, exploiting the breach, but it wasn't enough. The Deathworlders' retaliation was swift and brutal. Massive beams of energy shot out from their warships, striking key positions across the galaxy. Civilian worlds were left in ruin, and planets trembled under the weight of the destruction. In a hidden command center deep within one of the remaining strongholds, General Varric watched in disbelief. His hands clenched around the console. The Deathworlders were too strong, too organized. The galaxy was being ripped apart before his eyes. He had thought that the combined might of the galaxy could stand against this force, but the reality was sinking in. The galaxy might never be the same, Varric muttered. The Deathworlders won't stop until they've taken everything. But the Deathworlders weren't finished. They had not yet unleashed their full might. As the battle raged on, the reality of the situation began to settle into the minds of those who fought. Victory was no longer certain, and with every ship that fell, the hope of survival grew more distant. And so, the battle continued. The fate of the galaxy rested in the hands of those who dared to fight back, but the Deathworlders were closing in, and they would not stop until the galaxy was theirs. The final battle had arrived. Every ship in the galaxy's remaining fleet, battered and bruised from days of brutal combat, had gathered for one last stand. It wasn't just a fight for territory or resources. It was a battle for survival. The Deathworlder fleet had already claimed countless systems, and now they set their sights on the heart of the galaxy, on the last bastion of resistance. Admiral Lyra stood at the helm of her flagship, her gaze fixed on the chaotic scene unfolding in front of her. The sky was ablaze with energy blasts, ships exploding in fiery bursts, and debris scattering in every direction. The Deathworlder's fleet, despite its overwhelming power, seemed to be faltering, but they were still a formidable enemy. "This is it," she muttered to herself, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. "We either win this, or we lose everything." The fleet had fought hard to get here, but it wasn't enough. The Deathworlders' new weapons, their sheer numbers, and their ruthless tactics had taken a toll. The Allies had lost ships, planets had fallen, and entire sectors were now nothing but ashes. But the final blow had not yet been dealt. Lyra had one last card to play, a secret weapon she had been saving for this moment. It was a gamble, and it could either turn the tide or seal their doom. The Deathworlders had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt and innovate, and now it was time to show them the true meaning of wrath. "Target their central command ship," she ordered, her voice filled with determination. "We end this now." The Allied fleet adjusted its formation, preparing for a final, coordinated assault. Ships powered up their remaining weapons, launching volleys of missiles and beams of concentrated energy at the Deathworlders' command ship. But the Deathworlders' fleet commander, aware of the danger, activated a defense system that turned the incoming fire into harmless flares. It seemed like the end, but then Lyra smiled grimly. She knew they had a secret weapon that the Deathworlders hadn't anticipated. From the depths of the Allied fleet emerged a massive ship, its silhouette massive against the backdrop of stars. It was a human-made dreadnought, built in secret by the united forces of the galaxy's surviving species. Its power core alone was enough to rival the combined might of any Deathworlder fleet. The dreadnought opened fire, its cannons unleashing a blast so powerful that the shockwave tore through the very fabric of space. The energy hit the Deathworlder flagship with such force that it caused the shields to crack, exposing the ship's vulnerable core. "That's our opening," Lyra shouted. With a wave of her hand, the remaining fleet ships rushed forward, targeting the exposed areas of the Deathworlder's flagship. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope. The Deathworlder's advantage was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. But just as victory seemed within reach, the Deathworlders retaliated with everything they had left. Massive waves of energy erupted from their ships, striking the heart of the Allied fleet. The dreadnought's shields flickered and began to fail under the relentless assault. The Deathworlders were making their final push to crush the remaining forces. Lyra felt the ground beneath her feet shake as explosions rocked the flagship. The Deathworlders weren't done yet. Their ships closed in, firing relentlessly as they sought to finish what they had started. But Layara refused to back down. She wasn't going to let everything they had fought for fall apart now. "Hold the line," she shouted. "We're not giving up." As the last of the Allied ships fired their final volleys at the enemy, something unexpected happened. In the chaos, a single ship emerged from the depths of the battle, a small, unassuming vessel that had been hidden among the wreckage. It was an ancient ship, one that had been part of humanity's first exploration of space. Its technology, although outdated, was still functional, and it was armed with a weapon that had been long forgotten. The ship, now piloted by a desperate crew of survivors, launched its weapon, the energy beam that could tear apart the very fabric of reality. The blast cut through the chaos, hitting the Deathworlder flagship with the force of a collapsing star. The shockwave sent ripples through the battlefield as the flagship was torn apart, its once mighty hull breaking into pieces. The Deathworlder fleet commander, his plans shattered, ordered a retreat. The battle had turned, and now it was the Deathworlders who were running for their lives. Admiral Layara watched as the enemy forces began to scatter, retreating into the void. The galaxy had won, but at a terrible cost. Thousands of ships had been lost, countless lives had been sacrificed, and entire worlds had been destroyed. But the Deathworlders had been stopped. As the Allied fleet regrouped, Layara stood at the helm of her flagship, a weary smile crossing her face. The war was over, and the galaxy had been saved. For now. But as she looked out into the vastness of space, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. The Deathworlders might be retreating, but they were not gone. The galaxy would have to remain vigilant, always prepared for the next challenge. The Deathworlders had learned a valuable lesson, but humanity had learned one too. When pushed to the brink, the galaxy could rise up, and together they would never fall.